Imagine having your nation's biggest rival camped right next to your leader's home. That's exactly what's happening in Burkina Faso, and people are furious. Let's break down why the French embassy's location has become a powder keg in Ouagadougou. Welcome to AfroPage. In this video, we're taking you to the heart of Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. Here, a storm is brewing over a building that's causing major tension. The French embassy sits just 63 meters away from the presidential palace. That's closer than a football field. This super close location is making people in Burkina Faso very uncomfortable. They're worried about their leader's safety and their country's independence. Protesters are filling the streets, demanding the embassy move somewhere else. It's a situation that's heating up fast, and it could have big effects on Burkina Faso's relationship with France. Let's dive into why this matters so much. You might be wondering why the French embassy's location is causing such a stir. To understand this, we need to look back at the history between France and Burkina Faso. It's a story that goes back more than a century. In the late 1800s, France took control of the area we now call Burkina Faso. Back then, it was known as Upper Volta and was part of French West Africa. This wasn't a friendly arrangement. France ruled over the country for decades, shaping its politics, economy, and culture. It wasn't until 1960 that Burkina Faso finally gained independence. But even after that, France's influence didn't disappear overnight. The French embassy's location is a perfect example of this lasting impact. The embassy sits just 63 meters from the presidential palace. That's closer than you might stand to your neighbor's house. This super close placement isn't an accident. It's a leftover from the days when France controlled everything in Burkina Faso. Think about it. The embassy's spot right next to the seat of power sends a clear message. It's like France is saying, we're still here, and we're still here, and we're still important for many people in Burkina Faso. This feels like France is still trying to control their country. This is why protesters are so upset. They see the embassy as more than just a building. It's a symbol of France's long-lasting influence over their nation. One protester put it this way: when the enemy is close to you, you have to be very careful. The enemy who shows himself is better than the enemy who hides, but our enemy is real. That's why we demand the French embassy be removed next to our president. These strong words show how many people in Burkina Faso feel about France's presence. They're tired of feeling like their country isn't fully independent. This feeling has been growing stronger in recent years. More and more people in Burkina Faso are speaking out against France. They believe France's influence has held their country back. At protests, you'll see signs saying things like "Down with Macron, down with France," and "We are a sovereign people." These protests aren't just about the embassy's location. They're about a bigger issue. Many people in Burkina Faso feel that France never really cared about their country's well-being. They're starting to appreciate their own ability to govern themselves and develop their nation. Interestingly, some protesters are waving Russian flags. This suggests they're looking for new allies, ones that aren't connected to their colonial past. It's a clear sign that people want change. The growing anti-French sentiment in Burkina Faso is more than just about history. It's about the country's future. People are asking big questions about who should have influence in their nation and how they can truly be independent. This situation with the French embassy is bringing all these feelings to the surface. It's not just about a building anymore. It's about Burkina Faso's identity as a nation and its relationship with its former colonizer. Now that we understand the history behind this tension, let's look at why the French embassy's location is causing such worry in Burkina Faso today. The embassy's closeness to the presidential palace isn't just a symbolic problem, it's seen as a real security threat. Imagine having your rival's headquarters right next to your home. That's how many Burkinabe feel about the French embassy being just 63 meters from their president's office. This super close distance is raising serious concerns about the safety of President Ibrahim Traore and other government leaders. But it's not just about physical safety. There's a growing fear that the embassy's location allows France to spy on Burkina Faso's government. People are worried that sensitive conversations and decisions could be easily overheard or intercepted. This fear of espionage is making many Burkinabe feel like their country's affairs aren't truly private or independent. These worries aren't just coming from a few people. Large groups of protesters, including members of the National Coordination of Citizens Watch Associations, are demanding that the French embassy be moved. They believe its current location puts their country's sovereignty at risk. One protester, Uproar, explained it this way: when the enemy is close to you, you have to be very careful. The enemy who shows himself is better than the enemy who hides, but our enemy is real. That's why we demand the French embassy be removed next to our president. These strong words show how deeply people feel about this issue. It's not just about a building anymore, it's about Burkina Faso's right to govern itself without interference. The protests have been intense, with people carrying signs that say things like "Down with Macron," "Down with France," and "We are a sovereign people." These messages make it clear that many Burkinabe see France's presence as a threat to their independence. The situation has gotten so tense that there have been clashes between protesters and security forces. These incidents have only added fuel to the fire, making people even more upset about France's influence in their country. It's important to understand that these concerns in Burkina Faso aren't happening in isolation. They're part of a bigger trend across the Sahel region of Africa. More and more countries in this area are pushing back against foreign military presence and influence, especially from their former colonial rulers. For many people in Burkina Faso, moving the French embassy isn't just about changing an address. It's about taking a stand for their country's independence and showing the world that they can make their own decisions. They want to be free from what they see as France's lingering control over their affairs. This push for sovereignty is changing how Burkina Faso sees its relationship with France. It's clear that many Burkinabe are ready for a new chapter in their country's story, one where they're fully in charge of their own future. The streets of Ouagadougou have become a stage for the people's voice. Thousands of protesters are making their concerns heard loud and clear. These demonstrations aren't just small gatherings, they're massive events that show how strongly Burkinabe feel about France's presence in their country. Let's take a closer look at what's happening on the ground. The protests are centered around the French embassy, with demonstrators demanding it be moved away from the presidential palace. It's not just a few people making noise, we're talking about large, organized groups like the National Coordination of Citizens Watch Associations leading the charge. The protesters aren't shy about their feelings. They're carrying national flags of Burkina Faso, showing their pride in their country. But that's not all. You'll also see Russian flags in the mix, hinting at a desire for new alliances. The signs they're carrying tell a clear story. Messages like "Down with Macron," "Down with France," and "We are a sovereign people" show exactly what's on their minds. But what are the protesters actually saying? Let's hear from some of them directly. Ibrahim, one of the demonstrators, put it this way: "We're not proud of the French embassy, which is close to our presidency and our security." Another protester, Pugolenko, explained, "We protested peacefully, telling the French embassy that we were not ready to accept it near our president." These aren't just empty words, they're expressing real concerns about their country's sovereignty and security. The protesters believe that having the French embassy so close to their president's office is a risk they're not willing to take. But the protests aren't just happening on the streets, they're also taking place online. Social media has become a powerful tool for this movement. People are sharing videos of the protests, spreading messages of support, and keeping the conversation going even when they're not physically at the demonstrations. This online activity is helping to amplify the protesters' voices and reach a wider audience. One of the most interesting things about these protests is who's leading them. It's not just older folks who remember colonial times, it's the youth of Burkina Faso who are at the forefront. These young people are showing a strong sense of nationalism and a real desire for their country to be truly independent. The energy of these young protesters is catching on. There's a growing spirit of Pan-Africanism and political awareness driving this push for change. People are starting to question the old ways of doing things and are demanding a new relationship with France, one where Burkina Faso is treated as an equal. This movement isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a bigger trend across Africa, where more and more countries are pushing back against what they see as lingering colonial influence. In Burkina Faso, this push is getting results. As Salifou Mak from the Black Alliance for Peace noted, the movements of the Traore administration have been in direct response to and in many cases in lockstep with, the demands of the people of Burkina Faso. The protests in Ouagadougou are more than just a temporary outburst. They represent a deep desire for change and a new direction for the country. The people of Burkina Faso are making it clear they want to write their own story, free from outside influence. Now that we've seen how strongly the people of Burkina Faso feel about the French embassy, you might be wondering, how is France responding to all of this? Their reaction could change the future of both countries. France has decided to keep its embassy right where it is, despite all the protests. They're not moving it away from the presidential palace. This choice is making the situation even more tense. It's like France is saying, "We're staying put, no matter what you say." This response from France isn't just affecting Burkina Faso. It's causing problems in other parts of West Africa too. Many countries in this region used to be French colonies, and they're watching what's happening in Burkina Faso very closely. France's decision to stay put could harm its relationships with these countries. People are starting to question if France really respects their independence. It's not just about an embassy anymore, it's about how France treats its former colonies. The protests in Burkina Faso aren't happening in a bubble. Similar movements are popping up in other African countries too. In Mali and Niger, people have been pushing back against French military presence. They're saying, "We can handle our own security, thank you very much." These anti-French feelings are spreading fast across the Sahel region. More and more people are calling for less Western influence and more African control. It's like a wave of change is sweeping across this part of Africa. For France, this is a big problem. They've had a lot of power in West Africa for a long time, but now that power is starting to slip away. Countries that used to look to France for help are now turning to other partners like Russia. You can see this shift in Burkina Faso. Some protesters are waving Russian flags alongside their own country's flag. It's a clear message that they're open to new friendships and moving away from old ties with France. This situation is forcing France to rethink its approach in Africa. The old ways of doing things aren't working anymore. France needs to find a new way to work with these countries if it wants to keep its influence in the region. But it's not just about France. Other Western countries are watching this situation closely too. They're worried that if France loses influence in West Africa, they might lose out as well. So what does all this mean for the future? It's hard to say for sure, but one thing is clear: the relationship between France and its former colonies is changing fast. The protests in Burkina Faso could be just the beginning of a much bigger shift in how African countries deal with their former colonizers. As we watch this situation unfold, it's important to remember that it's about more than just one embassy or one country. It's about a whole continent trying to find its place in the world and decide its own future. The choices made by France and Burkina Faso in the coming days could shape Africa for years to come. Now that we've seen the tension building in Burkina Faso, let's talk about what might happen next. The situation with the French embassy isn't just a local issue, it's part of a bigger story about power and independence in Africa. So what's really at stake here? It's not just about moving a building. It's about Burkina Faso's right to make its own decisions. The people want to feel safe and in control of their country. But how can this problem be solved? Maybe France could move the embassy as a sign of goodwill, or Burkina Faso could offer a new location that works for both sides. Whatever happens, it's clear that things can't stay the same. This moment could be a turning point for Burkina Faso. It's a chance for the country to reshape its relationship with France and show the world it's ready to stand on its own.